Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a Python method that might seem kind of basic at first, but trust me, it's way more powerful than you think. We're talking about the .split method, and we'll be using excerpts from a guide that breaks down how to really make the most of .split. You're ready to be surprised, because we're about to uncover why even experienced developers rely on this thing for some seriously heavy lifting, like tackling those massive log files that can either be your best friend or your worst nightmare. But before we go there, let's start simple. Can you give us a quick explanation of what exactly the .split method does?
Of course. The split method, at its core, takes a string of text, like a sentence or a line of data, and it breaks it down into smaller parts. Think of chopping up a sentence into individual words. You just tell it which character you want to use as a separator, and the split method takes care of the rest. It's like, boom, done.
Okay, I'm following you so far. But I gotta admit, when I first learned about split, I was kind of like, yeah, that's cool and all, but when would I ever actually use this in the real world? You know what I mean? Like, help me see the light here. Yeah. What are some real world scenarios where split actually saves the day?
Oh, I totally get it. It can seem, pretty simple on the surface, like almost too simple to be really useful, right? But honestly, .split is like a secret weapon in Python. It can handle a ton of stuff. So let's go back to that example of analyzing a giant log file. Imagine you're staring at thousands of lines of text all jumbled together. Each line has like a timestamp, an error code, and a description. Using .split, you can quickly separate each element in those lines. It's like boom, boom, boom. Suddenly, you can actually make sense of that mess. You can find patterns and pinpoint specific errors much easier.
That's making a lot more sense now. It's like taking this huge, chaotic pile of information and organizing it into neat little compartments. So besides those super long log files, what other kinds of data can we wrangle with .split?
Oh, all sorts of things. One of the most common uses is working with CSV files, which are basically just spreadsheets saved as plain text. Each row in a CSV file is a string with all the values separated by commas. So you can use .split to turn each row into a list of separate data points, which makes it so much easier to analyze and process the information.
So if I was working with a CSV file that had employee data and I wanted to calculate the average salary .split, let me easily grab each employee's salary information, right?
Exactly. It pulls out those individual pieces of data and then, the possibilities are pretty much endless. You can calculate all sorts of statistics, create visualizations, search for specific entries, whatever you need.
Wow. Okay. I'm starting to see how powerful this can be. But I have a question. What if my data isn't neatly formatted, like in a nice comma-separated list? What if I've got multiple separators or weird spacing or just like general chaos?
Yeah.
Can't split handle that kind of mess?
That's a really good question. And it kind of brings us to one of the, limitations of the basics .split method. It's really designed for those simple cases, like when you just have one separator. But don't worry, Python has a bunch of other tools to handle those messier situations.
Yeah, that's where regular expressions come in. They're like superpowered search patterns. They let you define all these complex rules for how you want to match and change text. That can be super helpful.
Regular expressions. Yeah, I've definitely heard people talking about those. But they always sounded kind of intimidating, to be honest. I can totally understand why you'd think that. They can definitely seem pretty scary at first. But once you get the hang of the basics, they really open up a whole new world of text processing. It's like suddenly you can do anything. So with Split, Python has this module called re, and it gives you this function called re.split. It lets you use regular expressions to define a bunch of different delimiters or even more complex patterns for splitting your text.
So instead of being stuck with just commas or spaces, I could create patterns to handle all sorts of crazy separators, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. But before we go too deep into regular expressions, and trust me, that's going on my list of things to learn. Are there any other, quirks or gotchas with the regular .split method? Like things that could trip me up if I'm not careful?
Oh, absolutely. Even the basic .split has some little behaviors that can be a bit tricky if you're not paying attention. For example, let's say you try to use doSplit with a separator that isn't actually in the string. You might think it would throw an error or maybe just give you back an empty list, but that's not what happens. Instead, it'll give you back the original string as a list with just one element.
That's kind of interesting. It's like it's saying, hey, I couldn't find anything to split on, so here's your input back. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's good to be aware of it, especially if you're expecting your code to get a list with a certain number of elements.
Right. It's always those little things that can sneak up on you and cause problems later on.
There's also the fact that .split is case sensitive, which can trip people up sometimes. So if your separator has a certain capitalization, it's only going to split on those exact characters. Like if you try to split a sentence using A as your separator, it's not going to split on any lowercase as. It has to match exactly.
Ah, yeah, case sensitivity, the bane of every programmer's existence. So it sounds like with .split, paying attention to those details is super important.
It really is. And here's another little detail. .split will actually treat consecutive delimiters as separate splits. So if you've got a string with like 2 commas right next to each other, you'll end up with an extra empty string in your list. Like if you had apple, banana, orange with those 2 commas between apple and banana, you'd get back a list like this. Apple, banana, orange.
Gotcha. So it's like it splits on the first comma, it splits again on the second comma, even though there's nothing in between.
Right. It's good to remember that, especially if you're working with data that might have irregular spacing or multiple delimiters in a row. You might need to clean up that list later to get rid of those extra empty strings.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how to break strings apart with .split. But is there ever a time when we'd want to go the other way? Like, take a bunch of separate strings and put them all together into one big string.
Now you're thinking like a true Python programmer. And yes, there's definitely a way to do that. Python has this super useful method called .join. That's perfect for that.
Ooh, tell me more about .join. It sounds like exactly what I need sometimes.
Join basically does the opposite of .split. So instead of taking one string and breaking it into pieces, it takes a list of strings and smushes them all together into a single string. And you can even choose what separator you want to use between the strings. It's like magic.
So if .split is like a chef chopping everything up, .join is like the person who puts it all back together nicely on the plate.
I love that analogy. They really are a perfect pair.
Can you give me a quick example of how .join works in action?
Of course. Let's say you have a list of words like hello world.
Yeah.
Use .join with a space as your separator, and it would give you back the string hello world.
That's so cool. So split and .join are like 2 sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
You can use them to break things apart or put them back together, whatever you need.
Exactly. Once you master both of them, you've got so much power and flexibility when you're working with text in Python. It's really amazing what you can do.
My mind is already racing with all the ways I could use this dynamic duo in my own projects. But before we wrap up our deep dive, is there anything else about split or .join that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, there's always something more to learn with Python. We talked about the maxsplit parameter a little while ago, but we didn't really dive into what it can do.
Right. Maxsplit, what's the deal with that? Why would I want to use it?
Well, it gives you even more control over how your string gets split. So instead of splitting at every single separator, it lets you choose how many times you want it to split.
Oh, interesting. So instead of getting a list of, 10 words from a sentence, I could tell it to just give me, like, the first 3.
Exactly. That's a really good way to think about it. Like, imagine you're working with some data where you only care about the first couple of fields in each line, but the rest of the line is just, extra stuff you don't need. Maxsplit lets you grab just those important pieces without having to waste time processing the whole line.
That's pretty cool. I'm definitely starting to see how all these little features can really make a difference when you're coding in the real world.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's one of the things I really love about Python. It's full of these little, hidden gems that give you so much control and flexibility.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into .split, what are the big takeaways you want listeners to remember?
Well, first of all, I'd say don't underestimate the power of simple things. Split may seem pretty basic, but it's seriously a foundational tool for working with text in Python. And second, even though .split by itself is really designed for those situations with just one separator, you can always make it more powerful by combining it with other tools, like those regular expressions we were talking about. Don't be afraid to explore those more advanced features as you get more comfortable with the basics. There's so much you can do. And finally, the most important thing is to remember that coding is all about experimenting and having fun. So play around with .split, .join, and all the other amazing tools that Python has to offer. You'll be amazed by what you can create.
That's awesome advice. I feel like this deep dive has totally opened my eyes to all the different ways I can use Split. I'm already thinking about all sorts of projects where I can try it out. And to all our listeners out there, I hope you're feeling inspired too. Don't just listen to us talk about code, Get out there and write some code yourself. Experiment, have fun, and see what amazing things you can build. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Python's .split method. Until next time, happy coding.